So I've measured a boundary, a border around the sides of the card. I didn't quite get it right here. I'm just going to put another tape over top, exactly where that line should be. So the masking tape will hold down the watercolor paper. It will also give a border around the picture, around the painting for the card. This watercolor paper, I have made sure that it's the right size. This will be the back of the card and this will be the front. So it will fold in half and fit into the envelope that I have for it. This is a piece of watercolor paper, 140 pound, and it's smooth as opposed to rough. Cold press, pardon me. Now I will draw the design on, use masking, and proceed to paint. Now my drawing is finished, and I'm going to use this art masking fluid. That will cover the trees so I can paint the background without worrying about the trees in the foreground. I think it's easier to apply, with a big bubble on the top of it, if I put it in a smaller, easier to use container. So I'm going to pour some of it in this little container. Better not to shake this. You'll get a bunch of air bubbles if you do. If you need to mix it, just tip it back and forth. You don't need much, and a bottle lasts a long time. The problem is, if you use a paintbrush, it will ruin your paintbrush. So use dollar store paintbrushes, really cheap ones. This is an old dollar store paintbrush, and this is called an Incredible Nib, and I use it to apply the masking as well. So these two little trees in the foreground are going to be masked. This will dry, and then I'll be able to paint the background without worrying about ruining these little trees in the foreground. One of the things about watercolors that you can't paint over top because they're transparent. I have drawn this drawing quite dark in the foreground and quite light in the background. You'll be able to pick up the drawing on my blog if you want to copy the drawing, or maybe you'll be able to draw it yourself. So the masking has to be completely dry before I do anything in the background, and don't have to worry too much about details here. And maybe some of this here. I like the way the paintbrush is behaving. I'll probably just use it. There's not a whole lot of bristles left on this because I've cleaned it from previous uses, and the bristles come out with the masking when you pull it off. Another thing that sometimes painters do is they dip the paintbrush in some dishwash liquid and then put the masking on. And the dishwashing liquid prevents the masking from sticking to the paintbrush, so you can just pull it off very easily afterwards when it dries. I once had a problem with that. You have to excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. But once after I got the masking off of the painting and began to paint, I got some bubbles appeared. Strangest thing. So I've never used the dish soap after that. And it's really important that you never use masking on wet paper because it will stick to the wet paper and you may never be able to get it off. So sometimes you can get away with that and sometimes you can't. I did apply it when I was going to do a second layer of paint, and the paper was a little wet, and I finished the painting. I was really happy with it. Went to remove the masking and it wouldn't come off without pulling some of the paper off with it. So the painting was ruined. So I would advise you never to use it on wet paint. The other thing is, and this sometimes you can get away with, sometimes you can't, so I would advise you not to use a hairdryer if you have masking on your painting. Sometimes we get impatient, we want to see something, we want to continue to the next stage, and we don't want to wait for the paint to dry, so we use a hairdryer, which is fine if there's no masking. But a hairdryer, if used too close to the paper, will somehow adhere this masking to the paper once again. When you try to take the masking off, it will take the paper off with it, which is devastating because you've finished your painting. We take it off at the very end usually. There, the masking is finished. Now all the masking is finished, I will proceed to mix the colors. I'm mixing a shade of purple for the sky and background, using rose madder and indigo. I'll use a scrap of watercolor paper to test the colors. I'm doing a wash around the trees and the sky. This will create a background for all the other colors, and I don't have to worry too much about the color or how far down I go. I can change this as I go, and I can add water to change the intensity of the color. Bringing some Phthalo Blue into the wash, I mix a darker color for the trees. I paint in the shapes of the trees, giving little attention to detail. I don't have to worry too much here. They're going to be in the background, and the farther into the background, the less detail I want. That will push them backwards, and the detail of the trees in the front will bring them forward. Don't be too hard on yourself as you paint. There's always two sides of us. Part of us, one side, is thinking of concern and anxiety. Can I do this? I'm not an artist. I feel no confidence. And the other part of me is calm and has confidence and decisiveness. And which part is going to win? Well, it's the part that you pay attention to, the part that you feed. So just ignore those feelings of insecurity. That happens to every artist. You're an artist, that's why you're doing it. Just let it flow. Try to keep those feelings out of it. When I see that this part of the painting is finished, I let the paint dry. It's a good time to go for lunch. Then I begin to remove the masking. I use a masking pickup sometimes called a mask away, which is a tool you can buy on the internet or at art stores. And all the supplies I use are listed below with a link so you can purchase them. I do receive a small commission for these supplies, and that can help me to continue to create these videos for you free of charge and help me purchase things such as better lights, which I really need, better cameras and software. The masking can also be removed by rubbing your finger in a circular motion and pulling the masking away. I have re-wet all my paints using a spray bottle and brushing them a little with a paintbrush. Now I begin to mix the color for the shadows under the snow on each of the trees. There will be a shadow where the branches stick out under the snow. The first layer is quite light, and I add a darker layer over top of it, leaving some of the lighter area visible. I have zoomed in so you can see this clearly. The layers of color create depth and a 3D effect. I mix some Sap Green into the blue mixture to get a deep blue-green for the evergreen branches. I apply this using a really small brush. It's a number 2 round, one of my favorite brushes. Putting on the branches really brings these trees to life, and then we can see the shadows of the snow more clearly, and we'll be able to do finishing touches later. Now I'm using some of the darker blue color with some water added to it to put a shadow on the right side of both trees, putting a darker shadow under the branches. I decide I need more contrast in the background and darken it in places. Finally finished, I wait until the painting is completely dry to take off the masking tape. Once the painting is completely dry, I use an eraser to remove any pencil marks that are left. I remove the masking tape, making sure I pull it away from the paper to avoid tearing. I fold the card in half, and voila, the finished card.